Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jillian Dunks. I am an archivist in McMaster Library's Department of Archives and Research Collections, and today I will be moderating this session. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you to Rare Virtues and Most Ingenious Men, Benito Arias Montano, Christophe Plantin, and the remarkable emblem book Humanae, Salutis, Monumenta, an Archives Alive lecture provided by Ruth Ellen St. Onge. Before the presentation begins, I want to acknowledge the original and current inhabitants of this land, the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, on whose territories I, as a Hamilton resident and a McMaster employee, now live. This land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and allied nations to peaceably care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes. Hamilton is also covered by the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabewans-speaking Mississauga people and the Crown. Today we're discussing the intellectual ferment in 16th century Europe, and in this context I wanted to point out again the colonial and imperial ideologies and the actions which extend from this time period into our own. We in Canada are living on Indigenous land. I encourage those of you joining us today to remember this in tandem with what you learned today, to reflect on it deeply, and to allow this remembering to alter your inhabitants of this region. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, the wonderful Ruth Ellen St. Onge. Ruth Ellen joined McMaster University as the Distinctive Collections Cataloging Librarian in March 2023. She previously worked as Associate Curator of the Teaching Collections of Rare Book School at the University of Virginia from 2015 to 2022. She holds a Master of Information Studies degree and a doctorate in French and Book History and Print Culture from the University of Toronto. Her research interests include the history of publishing and book illustration from the early modern period to the present day. I'm going to move on now just to some housekeeping matters quickly. So this session will be recorded and there will be time at the end for questions. Again, please submit your questions for Ruth Ellen using the Q&A section of Zoom. And my colleague Bridget Whittle is also monitoring the Zoom chat to answer any questions that may arise there. With that in mind, please take it away, Ruth Ellen.
Jillian, just as I'm starting, I just want to make sure that my slides are visible for everyone.
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Jillian. I'll just start right away. We're in the Low Countries in the second half of the 16th century. The 17 provinces that now make up present-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands are ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs. Within these lands and throughout Europe, religious and political disputes between Protestants and Catholics raged, culminating in events including the Great Iconoclasm of 1566, in which groups of Calvinists stormed Catholic churches in the Low Countries and destroyed statues, paintings, and altars. We also had the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, marked by targeted assassinations of prominent French Huguenots and waves of mass violence against Protestants throughout France. To quote the Dutch humanist, historian, and lawyer and diplomat Hugo Grotius, who bore witness to this age in his Annals of the War in the Low Countries, although religion should have served to soften and unite souls, it became, by the fault of human weakness, the bitterest source of hatred. During the 80 years of violent civil war and religious strife that wreaked havoc in the Low Countries, the names of things were turned upside down, so that blind desire for strife was called pious ardor, and modesty and moderation cowardice, or even treason. Today I will speak of two men who, despite the chaotic and desperate times in which they lived, and despite their diverging backgrounds, worked together to create beautiful books expressing ideals of tolerance, humanity, and spiritual growth. In the early 1570s, while working on one of the largest and most ambitious scholarly projects of their day, the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, the publisher Christophe Plantin and the erudite Benito Arias Montano also published a lavishly illustrated book of biblical images, the Humanae Salutis Monumenta, or Monuments of Human Salvation. McMaster University Library holds 2 copies of this book. By looking at these copies closely, we'll be learning more about the individuals who created them, their complex publication history, and the surprising ways they were used and manipulated by readers in the decades and centuries after they were printed. The starting point of my monumental adventure began last spring to be exact, when I was tasked with cataloging recent rare book acquisitions at McMaster. My colleague Myron Groover had just purchased this beautiful book by the Plantin Press, and it was one of the first books I cataloged, and that was kind of the seed that began this entire project. So when I started out, I first described Humanae Salutis Monumenta as an emblem book. This is a genre of illustrated book that was popular in early modern Europe, and they can continue to inspire a robust body of scholarship. So there's emblem book studies, conferences, associations, journals, bibliographies, and so on. The main thing to note is that emblems have 3 characteristics. There's a brief motto in Latin or a vernacular language called the inscriptio. That's at the top of the image you see here. There's an enigmatic picture called the pictura, and then an epigram following that picture called the subscriptio. We have several notable early modern emblem books in our collection at McMaster. And so because of this kind of my knowledge of these types of books, including early examples printed by Plantin, when I first saw Humanae Salutis Monumento, I said, oh, this is an emblem book. But as we're going to learn today, it's much more than that. So when I started cataloging the newly acquired volume, which is the one with the red cover here, I discovered that there was actually a second copy of the same book already in our collections. However, the way that that second copy had been cataloged many decades ago made it hard to discover in our online catalog. So I went and retrieved it from the stacks, and I began comparing the 2 volumes. They do not have the same binding, which is not unusual for a hand-pressed book. And sadly, I don't have time to talk about the bindings today, although it's a very fascinating subject. The title page, at first glance, it's fully engraved, and it looks pretty much the same for each volume. There are some different marks of provenance, again, which I won't go into detail about, but you'll see the date 1571 at the bottom of this column here on both copies. And indeed, the older copy that had been in the collection for a long time was cataloged under the date of 1571. But as I started flipping through, it became really obvious that these were books from 2 different editions. So the setting of the type is different, as you can see here. You have the images are the same, but slightly different. So here in this one, this page opening, Jesus is facing in different directions. And then when you get to the poems, the images, they have the same subject matter, the same text, content, but one copy has these beautiful borders, the other copy does not. So by looking at these 2 books and figuring out how I was going to catalog them and making these observations, I had a lot of questions. So why was the same date used on both editions? When were they actually printed? And why did Plantin create this completely different quarto edition? And that's the other thing I forgot to mention before. So the red one is printed in the octavo format, and the larger one here with the parchment binding is printed in the quarto format. So 2 different formats. Why was this the case? And because they're just very interesting, beautiful books, I was curious to know more about the motivations that led Plantin and Benito Arias Montano to create these books. So in my journey to find all the facts I could about Humanae Monumenta Salutis, I was aided by the fact that the Plantin Press is one of the most richly documented presses in the West. There's a huge amount of research that has been done. The archives are very rich. And also a lot of Plantin's correspondence is available online, so you can read the letters that he wrote to Benito Arias Montano and vice versa. So many generations of scholars have been working on Plantin in many different languages and different disciplines. And then Benito Arias Montano is also someone who was kind of somewhat forgotten for several centuries after his death, but he's enjoyed a really remarkable renaissance in scholarship over the past couple decades. So everything that almost everything I'm speaking about today is kind of a distillation of all of this wonderful research that's been done. And I'll include a more detailed bibliography at the end of my slides. So to begin, who was Christophe Plantin? He is one of the most significant and well-documented printer publishers of early modern Europe. Léon Voet wrote a very large 2-volume biography of Plantin and his press. He wrote a 6-volume bibliography in collaboration with his wife, Jenny Grisol Voet. And as the Voets point out, Plantin, was not only a successful publisher, he also played an extremely important part in the development of Western thought. And so the history of his press is much more than the history of a large capitalist enterprise. It also reflects and is part of the great cultural currents of the West. In the past couple of years, an international team led by scholars including Goran Prut and Jan Sordet also published kind of a wonderful retrospective volume on Christophe Plantin, and they point out the importance of the longevity of the firm. It lasted until the late 19th century. And, quote, its successful ambition in creating a brand of typographical excellence and economic vigilance. And finally, its role in the formal evolution of the printed book at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. So Plantin was actually a Frenchman. He was born in France, and early on, he apprenticed to a bookbinder in Caen, Normandy. And while he was learning to be a bookbinder, he met Jeanne Rivière, who's also called Joanna Rivière, and they got married. They ended up having 5 daughters, and one son who actually passed away in childhood at a very early age. They moved to Paris, where they set up shop selling prints and other items, and then they eventually moved to Antwerp, and there Plantin became a member of the Printing Guild in 1555. So in addition to publishing books, the family also dealt in the sale of luxury goods, including linens, drapery, and lace. And over his career, Plantin, he oversaw the publication of 141 books. His books were geared towards the French market. He also was a very significant publisher of liturgical books for Spain, and very active in selling books throughout Europe. He maintained a shop in Paris, and later on in his career, he also maintained kind of an outpost in Leiden, but we're not going to talk about that. Sorry, I think I have the wrong city there. So I'm just going to skip that. It should be Leiden, not Louvain. But one thing to note about Plantin is that he had kind of an unusual religious background. So he was outwardly Catholic, but he was often suspected of Calvinist sympathies for reasons we won't go into detail about. And then in the late 19th century, some letters were discovered that seemed to show that he was part of a kind of clandestine group called the Family of Love, or the House of Love, that was, again, linked. Most of the people part of this group were practicing Catholics, but they had kind of heterodox ideas that they held privately and didn't really share with the public. I'm not going to go into detail about that whole side of Plantin's life, but it is just to say that he was navigating in very treacherous waters during a time of great religious upheaval. So it was significantly, like, it could cause big problems for him, basically, to be parts of groups like this. So he was a publisher of religious texts and interested in religion. And because he so often ran into problems with the authorities, he did things like he would fine his workers if they ever let printing proofs leave the press, because he didn't want them to be shared with the authorities. So if you did that and you worked for Plantin, you had to pay a fine of 2 weeks' wages. In the 1560s, he started developing a plan to print a multi-language edition of the Bible. He approached several different rulers to fund this project, and then finally he obtained the official support of the ultra-Catholic Philip II of Spain, who was then also the ruler of the Low Countries. And it was through this project that he met Benito Arias Montano. So way back in 1972, the scholar Bernard Rakers noted in his short biographical study of Arias Montano that hasn't never been a full biography written about this man, because his life was so complex and he played such an important role in so many different fields and arenas. So a lot of the scholarship written on Benito Arias Montano is in many different languages and from different disciplines, and they don't always overlap. He was born in the southwest of Spain to a family that was impoverished but of relatively high social standing. He studied at the universities of Seville and Alcalá, so he was an expert in the Bible, in languages used, the original languages of the Bible. And in 1560, he became the priest in the military order of St. James. And actually, in recent years, it turns out scholars uncovered the fact that Benito Arias Montano's family were actually of converso origins, which meant that they were members of the Jewish community that had been kind of forced to convert to Catholicism during the reconquest of Spain. And during his lifetime, this wasn't known. If it had been known, he wouldn't have been allowed to join the military order of St. James, and he would have been blocked from some of the high-standing positions he had later in life. He became kind of famous at the Council of Trent, where he delivered 2 speeches, and he was part of the Spanish delegation. And then, because he gained this attention and he proved to be kind of a very reliable individual, he was appointed chaplain to Philip II, which wasn't like a direct, he wasn't a direct part of the household of Philip II, but he received a pension. And finally, in 1568, he was designated by the king to supervise this project of printing the Polyglot Bible. And so he had to go to Antwerp to do this. He left Spain for Antwerp in March of that year, and even his journey from Spain to Antwerp sounds incredibly interesting and fascinating, and I would love to find out more about what actually happened. Because his ship was blown off course and landed on the west coast of Ireland, and he had to make his way across Ireland and England, and then catch a ship on the other side of England to get to Antwerp. At that time, just as a reminder, this was, Queen Elizabeth I, very hostile country for a Catholic Spanish priest. And he notes in his letters after the fact that he had encounters that were both civil and uncivil as he was making his way to Antwerp. And Plantin, of course, had to be a little bit apprehensive about this really erudite, respected Catholic priest coming to oversee the work at his press, because of his past history, the troubles he had had with the authorities, and his own personal beliefs, which were kind of heterodox. But when Benito Arias Montano arrived, in his letters, Plantin began to write in glowing terms about the priest. In a June 1568 letter to the secretary of Philip II, Plantin states, "For I felt myself to be attracted, constrained, and voluntarily ravished and transported to love and revere the said Sir Arias Montano." He says that Montano was very gifted and filled with all the divine graces that he knows. And then this kind of charming letter to the abbot Jan Mothlan, Plantin states, "I resolved to show proper deference to the said Dr. Arias Montano, and straightway carried this out with all my power, not as I should, but in my simple manner. But since he has permitted me the liberty of conversing familiarly with him, I found myself so captivated and enraptured with love and reverence for his rare virtues. I admire him, and as one completely bewildered, I often do not know if I should be silent or answer him, even when he speaks to me." So Plantin is almost starstruck by Arias Montano, and this would be the beginning of a lifelong friendship and working relationship. Meanwhile, Montano, when he arrived in the Low Countries, had a bit of a culture shock. In his early letters, he kind of complained that the people there were, living much more permissive lives and much more interested in eating and drinking than they should be. But over the years, he became more sympathetic to the people of the Low Countries, and he also made many close friendships, not only with Plantin, but with other individuals like the cartographer Abraham Ortelius. And while he was working on the Polyglot Bible, he worked on various tasks for Philip II, and also was a commercial agent in that he acquired books, manuscripts, paintings, objects in Antwerp, which was, of course, was a booming merchant city at that time, and he sent them back to Spain. So the Polyglot Bible, we're very privileged at McMaster because we actually have a copy of this book, which is extremely important. It's known as the Plantin Polyglot, the Antwerp Polyglot, or the Biblia Regia, because it was officially sponsored by Philip II. It took several years to complete, and a large team of scholars was working on it. There's 8 volumes, or most of the copies have 8 volumes. Some have more just because of the size of paper that was used. But the first 4 are the Old Testament, the 5th is the New Testament, and then volumes 6 to 8 are what's called the apparatus. And so the text of the Bible was printed in the original languages, so languages like Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic. And then this apparatus was the work of Benito Arias Montano and other scholars. And as Maria M. Portuondo explains in her excellent recent study of Montano and natural philosophy, quote, "All the reference material necessary for the careful, informed study of the whole Bible was provided in the apparatus. Grammars and lexicons were made available so that a curious student could engage with the Bible directly. Arias Montano made sure that readers understood the cultural and historical context from which the Bible had sprung," end quote. According to Voet, Montano spent 11 hours a day, including Sundays and holy days, working on the Polyglot Bible. That's kind of the same amount of time I've spent on preparing this talk. So but he was a very serious worker. And even though he was overseeing the project, there are many other individuals involved, some of whom were even of Protestant affiliation. And also at the library here at McMaster, this is the year of gender and social justice. So I'd like to point out that women also played an important role in the Bible, in that Plantin's daughters carried out all sorts of different tasks around the press. So they did things like keeping accounts. And for the Polyglot Bible project, they did things like deliver proofs and correct proofs and so on. Also, the beautiful illustrations, engraved title pages like this one you see here from the first volume were printed by a woman printer called Minkin Leofrink, and she specialized in intaglio printing, which is printing on a rolling press, printing copper plates on a rolling press, which is a different technique and a different skill set than printing text on a relief press. The Bible was controversial, and it was attacked by religious authorities and kind of barely scraped through the religious approbation. but I won't be able to talk about it in detail, but there is a very interesting dissertation on the topic by Theodore Dunkelgruen, who is also publishing a book on the same subject, and he just gave a great talk on the Polyglot Bible at the launch of the new research tool Plantin Press Online, which was created by the Plantin Moretus Museum and which was launched Monday of this week. So I mentioned that we have a copy of this book at McMaster, and I kind of forced my coworkers to pose with it because I just want to give an example or show kind of the scale of this book. The 8 volumes are very large and heavy. And so Bronwyn Glover, our conservator, and Myron Groover, who's our rare book librarian, are standing beside the Polyglot Bible. And Bronwyn's holding the octavo Monumenta and Myron the quarto, just to show how they compare in size to the Polyglot Bible. So while all this work was going on this massive project in multiple languages, Humanae Salutis Monumenta was also being prepared by Plantin and Arias Montano. The text of the emblem book has a foreword and afterword, and a commentary by Plantin, or it's supposed to be by Plantin, but maybe Arias Montano contributed to it. It includes the usual official approbation from ecclesiastical authorities and the printing privilege. And then there's 72 Latin odes by Benito Arias Montano. So in his foreword, Plantin explains that the book is meant to promote the study of good literature and scripture. And he describes how the 71 odes accompanied by, well, there's actually possibly 72. I'll get back to that. So Plantin says in his foreword that they're accompanied by illustrations by the most skillful artists and engravers, including Peter van der Borck and the Wierix brothers. And the whole point of the book, as he explains in the foreword, is that it's describing the mystery of human salvation from the fall of Adam and Eve to the revelation of St. John. And we know actually from archival records that the plates and the borders used to illustrate the octavo edition of this book were also used at the same time to illustrate a book of hours that Plantin printed. And like the illustrations in the Polyglot Bible, they were printed, the illustrations were printed by Mencken Leofrink, whereas the text was printed by Plantin at his press and along with his workers. So here are 2 page spreads from the McMaster copy of the octavo edition. The poems describe what's happening in the image on, the facing page. Montano had been writing poetry since he was a student, and he was apparently, he was writing these poems also in his spare time when he wasn't working on the Bible. Just to give you an idea of the content, as far as I know, these have never been officially translated into English, although there is a modern Spanish translation. So the poem here, one of the earlier poems that's aligned with this image of the fall of Adam and Eve, it describes, the temptation by the serpent and states that original sin is the origin of strife, dissension, and fury that has marked human history. Then on the other side, you have the final image and poem, which depicts the Last Judgment. And the poem describes how, humans are going to reap what they sow. The righteous will celebrate in heaven while the evil will be punished. And the poem is kind of urging the reader, make sure that you follow the narrow path and don't go astray, because otherwise you'll end up punished. Then the commentary at the end of the book clarifies this message and says, if you cultivate piety and virtue, you're going to be crowned. And that, in the short space of this life that we have, make sure that you live correctly so you don't experience these kind of punishments at the Last Judgment. Some other illustrations. So we have Jacob's Dream here and the Annunciation. And a note on the illustration. So Montano wrote the poems, but he also carefully designed the images and what they contained, and then gave those directions to the artist Peter van der Borch, who drew them. And this is, Plantin mentions this in the foreword, and also Arias Montano talks about this in some of his letters. The art historian Sylvain Hansel believes that Montano was inspired by Albrecht Dürer's prints of the Passion of the Christ, which he had seen in the collection of Abraham Ortelius. So Montano actually collected prints as well. And he was cultivating friendships with artists and engravers throughout his life. So I'd like to there's several individuals who did the art for this book. I'd just like to talk about two of them. So Peter van der Borch was the artist who made all the drawings on which the engraved copper plates were based. He had previously illustrated Robert Dodin's Herbal for Plantin using woodcuts, and he lived in the town of Mechelen. When in 1572, his town was invaded by the Spanish army during the Dutch revolt, van der Borch and his family, his wife and small children, actually fled on foot to Antwerp, where they were welcomed into Plantin's home. Plantin took them in, and they had left so suddenly. They had, they were very ill when they arrived, and they barely had the clothes on their back. They ended up staying in Antwerp, and Peter van der Borch worked closely with Plantin for the rest of his life. And even after Plantin passed away, van der Borch was in charge of preparing an inventory of Plantin's copper plates, along with two other individuals. So that's the kind of wholesome guy, the reliable guy. Then we have the Wierix brothers. They were very young prodigies. They started engraving at a young age. They're very talented. There's Euronymous and Jan, and a third brother, Anton, who we're not going to talk about today because he didn't work on this book. So Jan was only 20 and Euronymous was only 17 when they started working for Plantin. Their names are spelled very differently depending on what language you're working in, so I just stuck with this one version. They were well paid because they were so skilled, but Plantin often complains about them in his letters. He says that they're stubborn, unreliable men who unabashedly demanded unreasonably high prices for their work, did not stick to their agreements, and were too wont to waste their time indulging in alcohol and other disrespectful activities, end quote. Nevertheless, he continued to employ them as much as he could, because sometimes, he couldn't pay them enough as what they wanted to be paid. And he often even would pay fines and drinking debts for them. So even though they had this kind of wild lifestyle, they became among the most successful and famous engravers of their time and had very long careers afterwards. And, their whole family became famous as engravers. So in the octavo copy, you have the initials on the actual illustrations. That's how we know who did what. So PB is Peter van der Borch. He often signed kind of the rocks at the bottom of a picture. The Wierix brothers usually put their initials at the top of the plate. And then on the last plate of the Last Judgment, Peter van der Borch includes a more detailed statement that he made the drawings, and it's written in Latin. At the bottom below, you see here with the feet. So that we know what's in the book. We know it's like basically poems, images. It's an emblem book. How was it actually printed? I'm going to briefly talk about the concepts of edition, issue, and state, because these are things you want to determine when you're cataloging a book. According to the descriptive manual for cataloging rare materials, an edition is all copies resulting from a single job of typographical description. And then you have an impression and then an issue, which are kind of like more specific kind of components of an edition. The problem is that early modern books don't always follow these rules, especially those with illustrations. And also, Plantin scholars have always been somewhat confused about what was going on with the publication history and of this book and how many editions there were. So Foot, in his bibliography, he thought there were 2 octavo editions, one with borders, one without. Then the art historian Marie Mauquois Hendrick, who wrote a very detailed catalog of all the prints of the Wierix family, she took way more time to think about this question, and she offered a more detailed description of the printing history. But it's really the work of 2 scholars, Karen Bowen and Dirk Imhoff, who also happen to be married to each other. They have published a lot of books, chapters, articles, either together or separately on the illustrated books of the Plantin Press. And it's really in the 2003 article that I summarize here that we understand what was going on with the octavo Monumenta. It's very complicated. So there's 3 distinct editions of the text, which are printed on the presses at the Plantin Press. Then those sheets were sent to Minken Liefrink for her to print the illustrations and the borders. And as you see from the slide here, this was going on in kind of batches over several years. So it's much more difficult to describe, first edition, second edition when you have this sort of situation. So there's actually, in 1571, there's 2 editions, or one with the borders, one without. I went to go look at a copy at the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies, and they have a copy without borders, which, as you see, is slightly smaller because the pages could be trimmed at a smaller size, and it just has a different feel than the copy we have, which has borders. The plates, because they were being printed in the Monumenta, but also the Book of Hours, they would wear out, and then new versions were made. So you have actual multiple versions of certain illustrations and multiple versions of the borders. And by describing these patterns of illustration, Bowen is able to kind of provide a table where you can situate your copy in the timeline. So it turns out that the copy we have at McMaster corresponds to the 1571 edition type B. And that's because we have illustrations that have been replaced versus an earlier issue of this edition. And our borders also match up with this type B version that Bowen describes in her article. So the borders are extremely charming, as you see here. There's little animals, flowers. They're actually kind of inspired by the manuscript Book of Hours that were coming out at the same time. Even though we're in the age of print, you still have illuminators producing luxury manuscripts. And the borders in those manuscripts looked very similar to what Plantin was doing. So here is a Book of Hours that's now in the Morgan Library. It's talked about in Christopher de Hamel's new book. The border is replicated on the cover of his study of manuscripts. And when I saw this, I was like, oh, that's like very similar to the peacock that we have in our book. And that's because, Plantin and his artists were probably trying to imitate these kind of illuminated borders from manuscript books. The borders also wore out much more quickly than the image plates. And so even in our copy, you see variations in how worn the borders are. So again, you have to be very careful about describing what's in your copy so that researchers will understand that it's not a simple question of first edition, second edition in the case of this book. And here we have some examples of the minor errors of registration that occurred because when you have printing going on, different layers of printing, it's always sometimes difficult to line things up. But even so, Minken Leofrink and her team were extremely skilled. So I know my title of my talk was Ingenious Men, but I think we could also mention the ingenuity of Minken Leofrink, who was a very talented intaglio printer. And really, this edition of the Monumenta is a technical feat. It was intended for a learned audience, sold and distributed throughout Europe. But what happened between the octavo edition and the quarto edition? So, as we know, this was a time of great crisis. In 1572, you have the revolt breaking out. Plantin was actually sent on a secret mission because he was supposed to take all of the luxury manuscripts that had been acquired and other items that had been acquired for the Spanish king and get them out of the Low Countries, which had so much war going on, and bring them to Milan, which was then a Spanish under Spanish control. But during this trip, he actually abandoned his mission. At the same time, a lot of the workers at his press back in Antwerp went on strike. And why did this happen? As Foote pointed out in his history, this was the same week that St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happened in 1572. And his workers went on strike because they just had received the news of this event. Plantin, as you remember, had a Paris outpost, and it was actually being operated, kind of overseen by two of his daughters at that time. So he rushed to Paris because he wanted to see if, his daughters were okay during this mass violence event, and also his close friend who was living there as well. Thankfully, they were okay. But things just continued to get worse during this decade. We have the Spanish Fury in 1576. So this is when the Spanish army mutinied. The mutineers the army soldiers weren't getting paid by the Spanish crown, so they kind of just lost control and attacked several cities. Antwerp was sacked for 3 days, and Plantin and his family, kind of barely survived this trauma. Multiple fires threatened their building. Their property and cash was looted, and they were ransomed multiple times by the mutineers. So they had to actually pay in order not to be killed. So they did survive. Plantin describes all of this in his letters to Benito Arias Montano, who by that point was no longer in Antwerp and had gone back to Spain. But the city of Antwerp and Plantin would never really be the same. So in the 1580s, Plantin is kind of not at a high point. He's having some problems. And less is known about the Quarto Monumenta, which was published in 1583, and we know that from the archives. It still has a date of 1571 on the title page because by that point, in 1583, Antwerp was under the control of Calvinist authorities, and this Catholic book would not have been approved. At the same time, the Catholic theologians who would have provided the approbation were no longer in Antwerp. So it just made more sense to Plantin to keep the old date. Confuse the authorities. The plates have the same content, but they were executed by different artists and sometimes different engravers. There's no borders. There are fewer existing copies compared to the octavo edition. We just don't know as much about the publishing history. We do know that the plates were also used in Plantin's folio Latin Bible that came out around the same time. The McMaster copy is from the Barry Brown collection. This was a fairly large rare book collection that was acquired by William Reedy in the late 1960s from the Irish book collector Barry Brown. And as I started comparing the quarto with the octavo, I made an unusual discovery. So basically, that our copy has been extensively expurgated. So 30 of the 71 plates have been removed. And I was able to figure out what had been removed by looking at a digital complete digitized version that's available through the University of San Francisco Gleason Library digital collections. So which plates are missing from ours? I won't go through all 30, but the first ones I noticed were Adam and Eve. You'll notice here they're very nude. They're drawn away that's much more like focused on anatomy and musculature than in the octavo edition. So these are gone from our copy. Jacob's dream, not in our copy. The discovery of Moses in the rushes, like when he was found by the river. Here, the women you see are wearing kind of clinging, revealing robes. This is not in our copy. It's been ripped out. But also we have illustrations depicting things like the Annunciation or the birth of John the Baptist. They've been removed. Again, more plates of John the Baptist removed. And then these scenes of the flagellation and the resurrection of Jesus have been ripped out. And you'll notice Jesus, he's very muscular. And also the Roman soldiers, their bodies are described in great detail by the artist and the engraver. So what was going on here? I think my sense is that these images were removed because the figures in them were fully nude or semi-nude. The way that the figures are posed often exposes kind of lower arms and legs or buttocks. I was surprised that the images of infants in childbirth were removed. And I think there's many reasons for this. It's possible that they were removed because of the poems on the other side, but I think it's actually the images that were the issue. At that time, the visual culture of the Low Countries was much more permissive than in other places in Europe, like Spain. And Spain was one of the main markets for this emblem book. It's possible that the reader ripped out the plates because they wanted to put those illustrations on their wall, for example, maybe as a devotional icon to look at. And it's also possible that they had been removed for sale on the antiquarian market, although the way they were removed makes me think that they were just torn out. And so what may have happened is that they belonged to someone perhaps who is in a religious order. At some point, Montano had disciples in Spain who used this book as a teaching aid. And maybe during Montano's life and shortly after, it was a more permissive kind of group looking at these books. But as the decades go by, things become more strict and people become disconnected from the original context and they just see these, nude figures. But not only have things been taken away from this book, they've also been added, which was even more surprising for me to discover. So someone, not necessarily the person who tore out the images, but someone at some point in history has gone in and drawn on many of the surviving plates. And they've drawn these kind of, by hand with ink, these marks on the bodies of some of the figures. So you see here, these are the Israelites collecting manna in the Old Testament. On the chest and the arms of the woman on this man's back, you have these strange marks. These are done by hand by someone that's not printed. You see similar marks on the arms of the people in the background. The wedding at Cana, the same thing you see on the bride and around Jesus's neck here in the foreground. And then in this plate, this figure in the foreground is Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry the cross. He has the same marks on his back and buttocks and legs. So what are these marks? I believe that these are representations of acts of mortification and penance. So at that time, certain Christian individuals, and also in earlier centuries and throughout history, individuals have used implements like the discipline, which is a type of whip, a Salutis, which is a metal band that you put around your arm or your leg, or things like the hair shirt that irritates the skin. And this was, people did this in order to imitate Christ's sufferings and kind of to strengthen their spirit by disciplining their bodies. It's a documented practice among religious orders like the Discalced Carmelites. And actually in Barry Brown's collection, we have several books that he owned that are about Saint Teresa of Avila and her order. I have a quotation in French here. I won't translate in detail, but basically it's describing how Saint Teresa used these devices as a form of mortification. We have this other amazing book in our collection that is fully engraved. It was printed by a woman printer and engraved by a woman engraver. And it depicts Saint Teresa throwing herself on thorn bushes and stinging nettles in order to mortify her flesh. So I think that what's happening here is that possibly the person who owned the book was a member of these kind of religious orders, and they were drawing on the actual figures what they were practicing as a form of devotion. So a surprising discovery, to be sure, because it's something that's not often depicted in art at that time. And I definitely want to do more research about what the possible provenance of this book is. So as a conclusion, sadly, what happened after this book was published, Plantin died in 1589. Arias Montano would mourn him for the rest of his life. He writes some very moving letters to Plantin's heirs, describing, how he thinks about Plantin all the time. He cries, he misses him, he misses his brother. He retired to the countryside and wrote his works of natural philosophy. And after Montano passed away, his works were actually put on the index of prohibited books, even though he himself, back in the 1570s, had been preparing an index of prohibited and expurgated works for the Spanish monarchy. So that is one of the reasons why he was kind of slightly forgotten for certain centuries, because his books, including the books that we have here, were basically banned. And I just find Benito Arias Montano, Christophe Plantin to be really fascinating figures. I think it's important to learn more about what they did during their lives. And this is a way to honor kind of this amazing artifacts that we have in our collections. So my final thoughts are that books serve as a direct conduit that connect us to the people who made books, the people who read books, sometimes even the people who were manipulating or destroying books, and that by caring for these books, as conservators, librarians, archivists, and others, by taking care of the physical objects, by digitizing them, making detailed descriptions, we are ensuring that these histories survive. And sometimes these histories have been untold, or they need to be studied in more detail. So that's really what inspires me as a scholar and a cataloger. And I'm just so grateful that we have these books at McMaster, and I'm very pleased to announce that they've been fully digitized. So they will be made available for everyone who's not able to come see them in person. I'm not going to thank everyone verbally because we want to have time for questions, but a lot of people helped to make this possible. So you'll see your names here. And there's a meme describing how enthusiastic I've been about this project over the past several months. And then we have my bibliography, and then we can open it up to questions.
Ruth Ellen, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. Just so much fun. What a delight. So I'll remind everyone again to submit your questions in the Q&A. And I have a couple of pre-submitted questions to ask you, Ruth Ellen. Yeah, so to begin, are there any other books by Benito Arias Montano in the holdings of archives and research collections at McMaster?
Yes, we have a book, which I believe the link will be dropped in the chat right now. I don't remember the exact title, but it was also acquired by Myron Groover, who's also a big fan of the Plantin Press and Arias Montano. And it was Montano's edition of the travels of Benjamin of, I think it's Tudello, I can't remember exactly, but he was a Jewish traveler who traveled throughout the Near East and Asia in the 11th and 12th century. And Arias Montano actually created a new edition of this travel narrative. There, you've got the short title there, and published it during his lifetime. So it's an interesting historical document that actually I would like to spend more time looking at now that I'm kind of going to take a little break from the emblem books.
Thank you so much. So I'm curious too about future directions for your research. What other projects will you be pursuing kind of coming out of this?
Yeah, I think it would be really cool to do an exhibition either in person or online about the emblem books that we have. We'd like to look at all the Plantin Press books that we have in our collections and make sure that the descriptions are accurate and up to date. And then actually the new Plantin Press online project is meant to be kind of like citizen scholarship, so you can submit information about our copies to that project that's being run by the Plantin Museum in Antwerp. So I think that would be a really cool thing to do. And then also at some point, I would just love to go to Antwerp and do more research on the Quarto edition.
Great.
Oh, I'm so excited to hear that the Gleason Library, that was such a lifesaver, that was digitized. Thank you so much. Because yeah, otherwise it would have been difficult, or more time consuming to figure out which plates were missing from our copy.
I think I can see several questions have come in the Q&A, but the first one that I want to ask you is, we have present a graduate student who is researching emblems, and they are wondering whether you have identified any differences in the text of the two editions that were discussed today.
Yes, so I did notice there was a couple of very small differences in some of the mottos. And it's not something I had a lot of time to look at in detail, but I think there might have been some slight changes between the two.
Cool. Okay, I think we'll do one more question. Someone has asked, have you found that the borders on the image pages are always paired with the same central images? And what are the borders? What's the symbolism of some of the borders?
I think the borders don't necessarily, in terms of their content, don't necessarily connect to the images, as it were. They're more like a form of decoration. But there is like obvious symbolic meaning, because you have things like pictures of a lamb, which is a symbol of Jesus. But I think they were used in patterns, not necessarily that had to do with the content of the images. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm happy to talk more about it by email.
Great. Yeah, so if you are in this talk and you have further questions for Ruth Ellen, I'm assuming, Ruth Ellen, you'd be okay with some follow-ups via email? Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
And yeah,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
just like to thank everyone, especially Jillian and Bridget, who organized the Archives Alive series, and also our friends from Alumni Affairs, Christine and Dave, who manage a lot of the logistics and tech behind the scenes. So they made it really seamless and wonderful experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ruth Ellen. That was wonderful. Thank you to everyone who gave up some of their time to be here today. And this recording will be available online on the McMaster YouTube channel, probably in a few weeks, with full captions.
Yeah, and also thank you to Mark Pellegrino, who digitized these books very wonderfully and at short notice, so that they're now available to the public.